In this first lecture, I'd really like to talk about the history of opioids and also some clarification even in that term, as well as some of the recent history. I'd like to highlight some of the readings, a little bit from Dreamland, even though I'm going to talk more about Dreamland in my Sunday response to Dreamland, but also I'm going to highlight the 4 journal articles that I asked you to read, and a couple sources that I did not give you. You'll notice that even though some of the statistics are different and the timelines are a little different, they're all astronomical for this problem, epidemic. But let's look a little bit at the history, and I'm sorry if I'm looking down a little. I want to read some direct quotes for you. In 2014, nearly 1.9 million, that's 2 million Americans basically, were addicted to some form of prescription painkiller, more than those addicted to cocaine and heroin combined, although we do know that a lot of these individuals move on to heroin use. So we have to take that into consideration. While abuse of prescription pills for pain was reported to be going down in 2011, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, heroin use was reported to be increasing. In fact, in 2011, nearly 200,000 people tried heroin for the first time, just in that 1 year, new users. By 2014, the rates for prescription drug abuse were back up into the stratosphere, and heroin abuse nearly out of control, with an estimate of over 700,000 Americans having used the drug. So that's just kind of some large stats for you. But when we look at opiate addiction and the epidemic, here's some more statistics. The problem is also not limited to adults, as first use of opiates seems to be getting younger. And this is a very unfortunate part of this. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, reports that an estimated 52 million people, 20% of those aged 12 and older, have used prescription drugs for non-medical reasons at least once. 20% of those aged 12 or older. That's a large percentage of our youth population. Also, about 1 in 12 high school seniors reported non-medical use of the prescription drug Vicodin during the past year. About 1 in 20 high school seniors also reported abusing Oxycontin. This isn't limited to the younger crowd either, according to a 2011 study by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The rate of current illicit drug use in adults aged 50 to 59 increased to 6.3% in 2011 from 2.7%. So more than doubles. In 2002, with opiates being among the most commonly abused drugs, total number of opiate prescriptions dispensed by retail pharmacies in the United States rose from 76 million in 91 to 217 million in 2012. So the epidemic of opiate addiction and painkiller addiction has resulted in nearly 33,000 overdose deaths annually, while heroin continues to be a rising problem, opiate addiction in general is not the stereotypical drug problem that many of us think of when we picture the war on drugs. In fact, many times it involves a patient who began with a legitimate pain issue. So, as we look at this, we're seeing these numbers really getting out of control. When we look at the definition of opiates and the history of it, opiates by definition are considered to be natural alkaloids found in the resin of the opium poppy. However, some definitions of opiates include semi-synthetic substances. So opiates themselves can be natural or synthetic. However, natural opiates include opium, morphine, codeine. Other substances that are man-made are called opioids. These are most used to treat chronic pain. They're also highly addictive. They include Vicodin, oxycodone, Demerol, Dilaudid. Heroin is actually an opioid manufactured from morphine. So there is a nuance in opioid versus opiate, one being synthetic, one being natural, if you really want to be specific. When we look at the use of the poppy and the natural drugs, it goes back before written records, basically to primitive human beings. And they were used throughout history. We often kind of see history repeating itself as well. So there was a resurgence of the use of opium in the United States in the late 1800s, and led to all kinds of things from taxation to the opioid wars, and most of the opium was brought in from India. We also saw a resurgence during the first Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, because opium is produced there, and now we're seeing a resurgence more than ever before because of a combination of two things. One is synthetic pain medication in the form of pills, which begins the process, and then because of the high cost of these medications on the black market, people normally switch to heroin, or what's considered specifically black tar heroin, and that's coming from Mexico. When you look at the costs, if you're looking at Oxy, it's averaging $1 a milligram. So if you're looking at 10 milligrams, that's $10. Whereas heroin, about $40 a bag. So there is a big difference, because when an addict is buying the pill form, they have to buy multiple pills, take them throughout the day. It ends up being a few $100s for a day versus $40. Could go as low as $20 for the bag of heroin. So it really depends basically on availability. But a lot of times, once somebody becomes addicted, and we'll talk about this whole process of addiction, what actually occurs in the brain, and and the uniqueness of the addictions as well. Not all addictions are the same. I've taken some notes from a lot of different places as well. When we think about mapping this epidemic, a lot of it follows Mexican communities, simply because the current heroin comes from Mexico. It's also moved to a more higher socioeconomic population in the United States. And if you'll notice on the map in the very beginning of Dreamland, Pittsburgh is one of the cells, the heroin cells, on that map. It's the only cell in Pennsylvania. And also these also tend to follow highway corridors. When I've talked with state police regarding this, for instance in Westmoreland County, a lot of times, a lot of the heroin deals will occur along the highway at sheets or speed stops or something like that, just because of convenience, but also it's right along the main corridors. We can see how it runs all the way from New England, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, other New England places of Vermont, through Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh, Columbus, and then throughout the rest of the country. When we look at the preface, the book begins to look at the end of an age, Dreamland, the end of an age in America, a movement from semi-prosperous factory towns to the decline of that age and the towns that were built around those factories. So we see a number of things combining. The decline of an industrialized area and affluence, highway systems, heroin coming from Mexico as opposed to overseas, prescription drug use, and the invention of synthesized opioids. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the mental status in the United States. And I've talked about this in some of my other classes. One of the interesting things, if we compare the United States with European nations or other countries around the world, Americans, and not every American, but in general, the clients that I've often spoken to don't see the necessity of experiencing the full range of emotions. Most Europeans, and I personally believe that we have the full range of emotions for a purpose. There's a reason why we feel sad, or we feel pain, or we feel discomfort, or whatever the emotion is, there's a reason why we have that emotion. I can say personally that I've grown more as a human being when I was experiencing challenges uncomfortable emotions as opposed to happiness. Happiness is wonderful, but many times growth occurs most often when we are not experiencing a sense of happiness, but often a sense of anxiety or struggle. And that forces us to re-examine our lives, the situation, and to make some positive changes. I've often heard clients say, well, I'm not happy. And I say, well, that's okay. But I want to get kind of an understanding of their depression. What is the severity of that depression? A lot of times, another issue in American culture and other modern cultures throughout the world is our dependency on medication to solve issues. And this could be any issue from the common cold, which is a virus. We know it doesn't respond to antibiotics, but we overuse antibiotics because we don't want to go through the discomfort of overcoming a minor illness. Everything from antibiotics to the over-diagnosing and over-medicating of ADHD. It's important to teach skills, whether somebody is appropriately diagnosed with ADHD or whether it's overdiagnosed, but to teach individuals and children skills with impulse control and thinking about consequences and thinking about things before they act. Many times, though, children in our society are over-medicated. When we look at the medicating of our children for things like ADHD, bipolar, things like that, we know it's over-diagnosed. We know they're over-medicated. And this is not saying that it doesn't exist. I know that ADHD and bipolar disorders exist. However, many times we don't examine the severity of the symptoms appropriately. Many times it's overdiagnosed. And yes, this medication seems to help the symptomology, but it doesn't actually deal with a lot of the underlying issues or teach skills that can help these individuals without medication. So many times, whether it is dealing with emotions, whether it is dealing with minor pain or minor illnesses or overdiagnosis, we have become over-reliant on taking a pill to solve whatever we're dealing with. So one of the results of that is a desensitization of medication. So it used to be that people would understand the potency of taking a medication or the potency of a medication. But the American culture takes so many medications, we've become desensitized to the strength, the possibility of addiction, the side effects, all of the ramifications of those pills that we take. So many times we just see all the pills the same. We don't take into consideration what some of the side effects might be, like addiction. We only look at the easy relief that is offered. But I don't want to talk too much about that mentality right now. I want to talk more about the effects of opioids on our thoughts, our emotions, our brain chemistry next week. But I do want to point out some of the things that our articles talked about. Here we have the epidemic of prescription opioid abuse, the subsequent rising prevalence of heroin use, and the federal response. It's one of the better, more recent journal articles I found, published in 2015. Opium's first synthetic appearance as diamorphine was marked in 1898 as a cough suppressant by Bayer, like Bayer aspirin, and later named heroin. It was soon noticed that this compound quickly metabolized to morphine, considered the archetypal opioid, other formulations simply being derivatives of morphine structure. So that was really the origin of heroin as we know it today. And that was also the beginning of a previous epidemic. We notice a dramatic increase in the number of opioid prescriptions written in the United States from approximately 76 million in 1991 to 207 million in 2013. So that is almost 300 times increase. In the mid-2000s, we saw the origination of online pharmacies, and it was very easy for individuals to fax in a forged prescription and receive an opioid or another medication through the mail from these pharmacies. So at one point it reached as high as 1,400 pharmacies online. And data shows that during one quarter of 2004, 17.4 million users visited these pharmacies online. So we saw over 17 million prescriptions just in one quarter of a year. So just in 3 months. Since then, they've really tried to crack down on this form of pharmacy. One of the interesting things, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, between 2011 and 2012, a year, 68.9%, so 69%, of those aged 12 and older who reported prescription abuse obtained them freely, bought or stolen from either a friend or a relative, usually from an adult's medicine cabinet. There are certain things that we know where there's a high availability of these, and they are often stolen. They're often stolen from people's medicine cabinets. That's a very simple place to get them. If people are visiting other people's homes. Another place is, and they try to monitor this, but they just don't seem to be able to monitor it successfully, is homes for the elderly. These individuals do need appropriate pain medication, but many times people with an addiction will work in these places, and that's where they will steal a lot of the medication. Many times they'll take it to sell it. Many times they'll take it to use it. Hospitals are becoming a little more strict, but homes for the elderly, especially in the Pittsburgh area, we have the second largest number of elderly population in the country, second only to Florida. When we look at prescription opioid sales, they quadrupled between '99 and 2010, so 400% increase. By 2007, 12.5 million Americans reported using a prescription opioid non-medically. The usage of prescriptions within the past 30 days, so somebody saying, well, yes, I used one within the past 30 days, among students in 8th, 10th, and 12th grades increased 173% between 91 and 2001, so in 10 years. We're seeing very young people using these prescriptions. So obviously we can see the connection between prescriptions of opioids, and then because of cost and accessibility, the movement from prescription pain relievers to illegal substances like heroin. And then the next step is overdosing, because when we're looking at things like black tar heroin, it used to be heroin was highly processed and it came in a white crystal powder. And it was simply more processed, more pure, less impurities that could also add to an overdose. And now black tar heroin is only partially processed. It's cheaper, but it's also containing a lot of impurities. You're also not sure about the potency of it, how much to exactly use. All of these things, including mixing it with a lot of different combinations, and we'll go over all of those different types of opioids and the mixtures and things like that. But because that substance is highly unknown and all the ingredients or impurities or mixtures, it often leads to overdose. So the number of opioid deaths has risen dramatically as well. Emergency room visits related to prescription use increased from 59 to 121 per 100,000. Emergency room visits, just from 2004 to 2008, 123% increase attributed to hydrocodone, 152% increase attributed to oxycodone. So in 2011, 49% of the 5.1 million visits to the emergency department attributed to drug-related emergencies were a result of drug misuse or abuse. So a lot of increase there. By 2010, of the 38,329 deaths attributed to drug overdoses in the United States, 3/4 of the 57.7% involved psychotherapeutics were opioid related. So here we have deaths attributed to overdose, almost 40,000 in 2010. So we're going to talk more about this, and please read the articles. There's a lot more in them that I haven't covered, but I will let you read that on your own. Each article is a little different. So, for instance, the prescription opioid heroin crisis, a public health approach, has some really nice graphics for their statistics, and that might help put it into some better perspective for you. Look at the date of the publication and the years that they cover as well. So, for instance, some of them go from 2000 to 2014, which is fairly recent, but a broad span. So you can see 14 years of recent history. Another one just goes from 2010 to 2015, but you've got some really in-depth statistics, and you could even look it up by state and look at Pennsylvania, on a lot of the graphs in that one. So this is just a very brief, about a half-hour lecture about the general history of this epidemic. We're going to get into a lot more detail with future articles, and as we go through Dreamland, that author has done a lot of research, and I'll follow up on this in more detail in my Sunday post as well. All right, I will be looking forward to your discussion board posts. Thank you.